David, thank you so much for doing this. Important for people to know, you're not in the UK, are you?
Well, no. If I was, I would have. I was in the UK, like I could have been there in like 45 minutes if I were anywhere in the UK. So I would have driven. I'm kidding. I'm in America where 100 miles is not a long range, but 100 years is an awful long time, unlike the UK where it's flipped. So yeah, I'm in the United States.
It is interesting how sort of you folks love driving and just distance doesn't mean anything to you, you know, sort of.
Like how I drove 30 minutes out of my way to get a burger with you on my way to a totally different city in Texas when you were in Texas. Yeah, exactly. You made it worth it though.
Yeah, that was really good. We went to In-N-Out Burger, was it? Something like that. Mm-hmm. And then we had what did I have? A burger, I suppose.
Well, it's referred to as a double. So if we want to get specific to any In-N-Out fans that are watching, we got to get specific.
Yeah, it was really nice. And yeah, we met in Texas. Well, we didn't meet in Texas. Texas was when we last had a meal. Now, we met in Saudi Arabia, which is not where many people meet for the
No, it's not. It's not usually a place where you pick up new contacts, etc. Although it's turning into that, right? With a lot of work, a lot of effort to put on these conferences, put themselves at kind of move themselves more towards the center of the global economy and that sort of stuff. But yeah, we met at Saudi Arabia at Misk. If I remember right, you were the very first person of a 2-day conference that ever spoke any word whatsoever. That had to have been nerve-wracking for you.
And you were the last person that closed out and gave the closing keynote. So it's quite interesting how I opened it and you closed it. I mean, what's better, opening keynotes or closing keynotes?
Oh, absolutely opening. Because I don't know if you remember, but we were there. I was there for the entire time, even though I was the closing keynote. You spoke first. And all that happened afterwards was I collected business cards for you and took pictures for you of people who wanted their picture with you. And no one knew who I was because I hadn't spoken yet.
It's interesting because it's a great thing to sort of be like the closing keynote speaker, but at the same time, you kind of have to hang out, don't you? And just hang around and everyone's speaking. You're like, oh my gosh, I just want to. And it was boiling hot as well, wasn't it, in Saudi?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I much prefer, the closing is sort of, that honorific whatever, but I much prefer to go first, get it out of the way, maybe have a couple of people to come up and tell you were brilliant. And if you weren't, you just disappear because you're already done and you fulfilled your obligation, so you're gone.
And what would you say? I mean, whilst we're reminiscing on Saudi, what was your sort of impression? Was that your first time at the play in that region?
That was my first time in Saudi. Not my first time in the MENA region, obviously, but first time in Saudi. John Sinai, our mutual friend who we also met, well, I met him prior, but who you met in Saudi Arabia, said this thing that the more I interact with them, even post-event, the more I noticed, which is that Saudis under 30 are some of the most optimistic people I've met. There's a lot of social changes going on in Saudi. There's an attempt to sort of move the economy away from just pure oil to lots of other things, sort of similar to what Dubai did, et cetera. But because they're on the beginning of it instead of well established in it, pretty much, if you're under 30 or under 35 in Saudi Arabia, you are very, very optimistic about your country's future, which is weird, right? You're in the UK, I'm in the United States. Neither of our collection of young adults are very optimistic about the future, to say it politely. So that was really, really refreshing. And then just seeing the way, trying to take that massive leap in progress comes with tensions between, old world traditions and new world ideas and practices and what have you. And so seeing them try and navigate that, I don't know that they're quite there yet, but I don't know that any country trying to do what they're trying to do would be quite there yet. But that was probably the other thing that really stood out, was that mix of, and I'd seen similar in, I'd done some work in Kuwait before the pandemic, and that's a very similar idea. You have certain people that are really steeped in old world traditions and in Islamic traditions, and then you have others that are trying to be more progressive, et cetera. And it's a really interesting dynamic. It really, really is. And I don't see it done peaceably in a lot of other countries. I'm in the United States, where we have lots of old world conservative traditions and lots of new, and it's the cause of tension, and we call it the culture war and all of this sort of stuff. And at least in Saudi, it's not that much as it is in a lot of other countries that are struggling to deal with that. I don't know. Did you see something similar? What did you think?
No, I agree. I think I saw a similar thing. I mean, for me particularly, I'd never done work in that region before. So naturally, when I think about Saudi Arabia, I thought about the Crown Prince and what's often written about the Crown Prince here, which, shocker, isn't the nicest thing in the world. But then again, there are lots of stories and things that have happened in that region, and in the U.S. embassy, in the U.S. as well, that I guess for us it's the obsession of the British when they think about Saudi. So being there and seeing locals and talking to some people and actually understanding what it's like to live there. At Common Sense, we talk about two sides to every story. It was one of those moments where I thought, oh my gosh, there's a whole world here. It's not just, the kind of headlines and stories. There's actually people here doing their thing. And the other thing that struck me, David, is the opulence. Oh my Lord. The amount of gold and the hotel we stayed, it was, for someone who is used to, some of the listeners will know this, like to the Premier Inn or like to the Travel Lodge, which I stay, it was wild.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Our transport cars. I don't know if you got picked up in the airport. I got picked up in the airport.
Hummer.
I got picked up in a BMW 7 Series that had been wrapped in the colors and logo of the conference, and that's like that probably cost more to do than it cost to bring me there, right? And yet you do it. So yeah, I mean, you see that in a couple other Middle Eastern countries too. And I should say in good conscience, right? Like, exactly what you said. I make no apologies. I'm not trying to defend anything that any individual government has done. I just try and focus on the people, the citizens who are in it, et cetera. I mean, I'm an American. Look, I have to focus on people and not exactly governments, because we change ours so quickly and we go back and forth that I can't really defend anything in that regard anymore. I just try and get to know the people, the citizens, the ones that are actually trying to drive the change. And that was actually what the conference was about, right? Was people on the ground trying to drive change, especially younger leaders trying to drive change. And so that's what I tend to focus on and why I wanted to go there. But yeah, the breakfast. I remember I told you had to come to breakfast, right? Because of how elaborate. You skipped it
normally
the
I
first
skip
day.
Breakfast at hotels. It's like it's a sausage and it's an egg, and I'm like, whatever. But how many different types of dates were there again?
There were at least 8 different types of dates in the date bar at the place, and that was one station of many. Yeah.
It was a crazy time. But I'm looking forward to being back in that region. I have been having conversations about sort of things happening there, so it would be interesting to see how I get there. Now, the reason why you were there, like I said, was to give a keynote address, because you're an award-winning speaker, you're a best-selling author, and a lot of your work centers around work, essentially, right? The kind of philosophy of work, business of work, maximizing output, teams, things like that. So this episode, the reason why I was really excited to talk to you, not least because you just wrote a new book, but because a lot of people listening to this podcast are professionals. They're young professionals. They work, that's what they do. And I actually read a report not too long ago where I thought it was called the Gettysburg College did this research where they found that the average person works for 90,000 hours during their sort of like life, which is pretty wild. A lot of our time is spent at work. And so I just thought, well, let's talk about work and how we maximize work, or how we quit work, how we start work, how we work better, so to speak. But before we do all of that, I just thought it would be interesting to hear how you got into this line of work. How does one become a best-selling author and an award-winning speaker and all these sort of amazing things you do now? Hey there, just want to say thank you for listening or for watching this podcast. We have a great desire to grow this podcast, and one of the ways we're going to do that is if you listening follow, or if you are watching, you subscribe to the podcast. The faster it grows, the more guests we can get, but also the better the podcast guests. So please, just do me a favor, hit the subscribe button or the follow button. Back to the episode.
Well, let me tell you why first, and then we'll tell you how, right? Because I think the why is in line with exactly what you said. 90,000 hours. Work is central to our lives, and that's never gonna go away. Right. You see it even in people that are, there are very few people that are sort of totally financially independent and all they do is sit on a beach and drink Coronas like all of the commercials all the time. They're still active actively doing something, trying to make a contribution to the world, to their community, whatever it is. We call that work, right? Now, most of us, that's not work, right? If you're listening to this, if you're like a lot of common sense audience, you're on the tube right now, headed to work. Hi, hope you're having a great morning or great afternoon whenever you're listening to this. Or you're walking to your home office where you work from home, whatever it is. And so it's a central part of our life. Pre-pandemic, it was the core for a lot of us, right? It was 5 out of the 7 days a week. It was 8 out of the maybe 16 to 18 waking hours of the day, right? So it was very, very central to our lives. And so I think it's important to make sure that it doesn't suck. Right. And I'll give you this big realization came to me this way. Right. So my wife is an ER physician, which is not only work, but essential work, as we all learned during the pandemic. And when the pandemic started, we created this disinfection ritual, right? And anybody who's listening to this or has a friend who's a nurse or doctor or whomever remembers this. This was back when we were wiping down our groceries with bleach cloths, which actually was like makes no sense if you think about fruit and produce. Probably not a good idea to do that, but we were doing it out of fear, etc. We had this whole disinfection ritual. She'd come home and the only car, like there was one car out of our 2, we're American, that would go to work, right, and come back, and nobody else would drive that car. And she would come in our garage, and there would change her clothes, throw them in a dedicated hamper, right, spray down with Lysol, run right to the shower. It was the only time, we have 2 kids, it was the only time in our lives where it wasn't like come home from work and greet them immediately. It was no, run to the decontamination zone first, right? And watching that for like the 19th or 20th time, I had this realization about why I'm so passionate about work, right? Which is fundamentally there was something toxic at my wife's place of work. And one of her objectives in doing this ritual was to make sure that it doesn't come home, right? And I think it's the same way when we think about work. There, you can have a positive work environment. You actually might want to bring that home. But a lot of people struggle with a negative work environment and are trying their best to, even though it's so central to their life, to not let it infect the rest of their lives. Now, here's the thing I didn't tell you. None of it worked. We all got COVID, right? Married to an ER doctor. We all got COVID. We all got COVID relatively quickly into the pandemic, and we all got COVID multiple times during the pandemic. Yeah. So none of it worked. And so that's why my focus has been, okay, what can we change about work? Not necessarily get more out of work, but have more energy out of the work that we do, feel more purpose out of the work that we do, have a more positive work environment in the times we do, so that when we inevitably bring that into other spheres of our life, it's not infecting it. Or if it is infecting it, it's infecting it with something positive. I really haven't thought through the metaphor quite yet, but you know what I mean.
That's really interesting. The idea that, even there, you've sort of made a difference between almost work and play, or work life and home life. And I suppose for a lot of people, COVID meant work and play kind of became a weird mesh.
Yeah. Well,
and now, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that, the dirty little secret is it always was integrated. We used to talk about work-life balance and this idea that they were opposing spheres. And they really weren't, especially if you're younger, right? If you're sub 30, if you're not married, or if you're married but you're childless, et cetera, like, a lot of your life is work. A lot of your friends come from work, either directly working for your organization or who you interact with through your work, right? So it was always intermeshed. COVID made us realize that because it forced us to live at work or work from home, whatever you want to call it, but it was all the same. So COVID forced that onto us, but it was always there. It just wasn't as obvious.
Yeah. On that then, because I suppose that's even an interesting place to start is, yes, mental health is being spoken about much more, and that's a good thing. And it has people kind of wanting to reclaim their time from work almost. So what would you say to someone who's listening to this now, who has been kind of preoccupied with trying to kind of reclaim their time, get a work-life balance? Is it just should they give up and just stop trying to get that? Do they need to reshape how they think about work? How does one build a more sort of sustainable, balanced work and life, zone, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. So pre-pandemic, there was this really interesting study, and I'm blanking on what journal it was actually published in, but then the author wrote a summary of their findings in Harvard Business Review, which is why I found out about it. And essentially what they found was there were basically 2 types of people that attempted what you're talking about. And they called them the balancers and the integrators, right? The balancers were people who were trying to seek that balance. When I leave at 5 or 4:30 or 6 or whatever, when I leave work, I don't touch work until the next morning. And then there were integrators who were, maybe I leave a bit early and grab in with school, like grab my kids from school, do something active. And then when they're in bed, I fire up the laptop again and what have you. And one of the things they found was interesting. Most of the balancers would tell you that they've achieved it, which is what I think you're trying to describe. A lot of us are trying to be that balancer, pure, like fine lines between work and life and what have you. However, when disruptive things happened, so for example, you're at work and your kid falls on the playground and breaks their arm, which happened to me. That's why it's that's why it's top of mind. Or you're at home and suddenly like there's a major PR disaster or a client announces it leaves, even though you're on vacation, you're no longer actually on vacation, right? It was the integrators that could deal better with those changes, right? So why do I say all of that? Because I don't actually think we ought to be thinking about the boundaries between work and life in terms of hours, because I think that's a fool's errand. The balancers achieved something like that, and yet there are always going to be these moments where a demand at work or demand at life forces itself into your sphere, even though you're trying to operate in the other sphere. It's more that integrators idea. And what the integrators did was adapt habits and mental rituals and things that signaled switching in modes. And they switched back much more often, right? So this is less about, when I leave at 5, I'm done for the day, and more about what do I do to mentally flip? Like I'll give you an example. Actually, I'm practicing what I preach today, so I can't give you a pure example, but if you're listening to this, you can't see. So I'm holding up my cell phone right now. This is with me whenever I'm in work mode, right? But I flip actually back and forth between work and life mode often. And so upstairs where I have lunch and where now it's summer, so my kids are home, etc. I leave this down here, and when I go upstairs, I have an iPad. And the iPad has pretty much everything this has on it in terms of like Facebook and Twitter and blah, blah, blah. But what it doesn't have on it is email. What it doesn't have on it is anything that's a non-personal account. So like I'm only on Instagram and TikTok in a professional setting. They're not really personal mediums for me, right? So it doesn't have any of those things. So I flip back and forth throughout the day. I can't physically like say, I only work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. I have to flip back and forth with it. But I have this ritual of walking to the charging station, switching the devices, and switching that mentality kind of back and forth.
And does that sort of mentally tell you you're done with work for that day?
Or for the moment, not for that day, right? But for the moment. When I'm up there, I'm having lunch, because I try and take an actual lunch break. I work from home most of the time. I cook myself something, what have you. For that time, this is down here. Now, if this rings and it's something super emergent, I can always run downstairs and get it. But just that act of flipping them helps me mentally flip back and forth. And I do that multiple times a day. So my encouragement to most people, especially if you're still in a hybrid work environment, not full in the office and what have you, you're probably not going to achieve that kind of full balance thing. So instead, be thinking about what rituals you can use. If you were working in an office pre-pandemic, you were working in an office 5 days a week from 9 to 5 or what have you, then you already had that in the form of a commute. But most of us don't have that every day. And on those days we're working from home, we never replaced a mental ritual. I think thinking about that, those transition rituals, works a whole lot better than thinking about how we can balance out the hours, because it's just not going to happen.
I think one of the reasons, as you're speaking, I kind of started thinking about how fortunate I am, and I suppose how fortunate you are as well, in that we are both doing work we love, right? I run a business. I'm very, very fortunate. Some people listening to me now equally do work that they love. But I suppose that balancing thing might become a bit more important if you're doing work you don't love. If you're doing, you're working in finance, and you were meant to be that dancer, and so you're just hanging on for dear life. And so, because of how demanding the work is, you have to do it, and you're always being asked to do extra hours, that sort of thing, but you don't actually enjoy it. So, for someone like me, like my friends and my mum has to literally prise my hand off like my keyboard, because I'm addicted to what I do. And my issue is working too hard and not stopping. And I think the advice you just gave would be perfect for someone like me. But what would you say to someone who doesn't enjoy their work and they're like, I would like to do less of it, but
yeah. I mean, if I'm going to be totally candid, right? Because I follow you on Instagram, and I see in your stories a lot of times you're complaining about how often you're working. And I think it's funny because you're doing work that lights you up, and I have no problem with that. If you want to I hope you get enough sleep. That's it. But as long as you get enough sleep and you have enough time for a social life, 40 hours, 50 hours, 60, I don't know, it's work that lights you up. I totally agree with you on the other side. But I also disagree with it to some extent. Certainly, if you're working in a field, you said finance, and not everyone in finance is this stereotype. But if you feel like you're just sort of that greedy investment banker and you actually loathe what you do and it causes sort of an ethical cognitive dissonance in you, then we got to make a change. There's no other way around that, right? But for most people, you're working in a job that wasn't what childhood you wanted to do, what 20-something you wanted to do. But what we find is there's certain parts of it you like and certain parts of it you don't. And here's where the research gets really, really interesting. If you look at engagement data for individuals, all of us have jobs that involve some great things and some crap tasks, right? And it turns out that only about 25% of your time at work, so 1 day a week plus a couple hours, right? Or 2 hours out of an 8-hour day, shall we say. Only about 25% of your time needs to be doing that work that you are intrinsically motivated to do, that you're actually excited about doing, in order to keep you satisfied and engaged in the job. The challenge is some of us are not even at 25%. Right? So first things first, how do we get to that 25%? Right? How do we, and the easiest thing to do, especially if you're younger and you're in a newer role, the easiest thing to do is just volunteer to take on more of the stuff that lights you up and stop doing as often the stuff that doesn't. I mean, I know that sounds weird and counterintuitive, but most of us have jobs where the job description isn't actually as clear cut as the one we were hired to do. It changes all the time. And so by trying to take on more responsibility in an activity that you really love and lights you up and will be part of that 25%, and trying to either offload or sometimes literally just stop doing and no one notices you stopped doing. If you work for Mike, please don't do that. But everybody else, you can actually force that conversation with your manager, your supervisor, et cetera, about how you're adding all of this value over here and that really lights you up and you'd like to release some of these activities over here, and you can shape your job to get to that 25%. Now so that's just pure how we're spending our hours inside of work. The other thing I would tell you is what tends to happen is that 75%, and I hope for everybody it's like at least 50-50, but it only takes 25%. But that other sphere, that stuff that doesn't light you up, tends to be the stuff you remember. Humans are wired towards the negative. That explains pretty much all of news media, right? Humans are wired towards the negative, and so we tend to leave work thinking about those negative incidents, etc. So what can you do to remind yourself of those positives, to remind yourself of the time? Maybe it's a gratitude practice, like a bullet journaling thing. What I do, I have a folder in my email inbox I call #wins. The hashtag isn't there because I'm trying to be cool and young and hip. It's there because when you sort alphabetically, it automatically floats to the top. So no matter what new folders I create, it's always at the top. And whenever I get thank you notes or, positive stories or things that just remind me that the work that I'm doing matters and that I enjoy it, I drag it into that folder. And I try, and if I'm feeling particularly down, I try and stage my own little intervention by looking back through that, right? And trying to kind of recoup that. So it's not only what can you do to try and get yourself to at least 25%, and maybe the goal is one day 50% of tasks that really light you up. You're obviously at more than 50%. Right? But also, what can you do to remind yourself on a regular basis that the tasks you're doing do light you up and do matter, et cetera? At the end of the day, I don't really feel like there's certain positions where people obviously are working way, way too many hours. But if I'm being brutally honest, most people are actually only working a shade above 40 hours. In Europe, it's actually a shade under 40 hours a week. The problem is so much of what they're doing is not what lights them up, and what they're thinking about is not what excites them. And that makes them feel like they're giving so much more energy to that task than they are. So that's really the question. If you're doing 100, you're a great example. If you're doing the majority of work that really excites you and lights you up, you don't even keep track of the hours at that point because it's exciting and giving you energy.
Hey there, just want to say thank you for listening or for watching this podcast. We have a great desire to grow this podcast, and one of the ways we're going to do that is if you listening follow, or if you are watching, you subscribe to the podcast. The faster it grows, the more guests we can get, but also the better the podcast gets. So please, just do me a favor, hit the subscribe button or the follow button. Back to the episode. Let me pick up on what you said then, because you kind of answered, in part at least, what I was going to ask next, which is, one of the questions I get the most from kind of maybe younger professionals or people around me is how to make their work meaningful. You know, if you are the CEO of a company or you're the manager of a project, then oftentimes you're sort of right in the driving seat of making something come to life, and then so you can feel very much that what you're doing is important. If you're not there, it doesn't happen. All these sort of random things that our brain tells us. If you're further down the rung, or you see yourself as a sort of cog in the wheel, and you feel like your day-to-day tasks, you can't quite map how they relate. Again, we'll use finance since we've started, but you know, it's the known thing here for lots of young people to go to, say, Warwick University, or, you know, these, you know, and they get a job in finance in JP Morgan, then you're a junior analyst. And if we're being honest, you could quit the next week and JP Morgan would be absolutely fine. And you know, put whatever company you want in that sort of equation. When you see yourself as sort of inconsequential, you feel like you're not really being valued at work, how then do you make work meaningful? Again, remembering the stat that a lot of people spend like a lot of their life at work. How do you make work that's not that meaningful?
Yeah. So JP Morgan would be fine, but not everyone would. And focusing in on those people who wouldn't is the key. So in the new book, in Best Team Ever, there's your plug for you. Sorry, I'm great about plugs.
I was queuing you up.
No, that's beautiful. I appreciate the setup. We talk about a whole third of that book is dedicated to what I call pro-social purpose, which is what you saw in Saudi Arabia. As long as maybe you went to bed, I don't remember. But if you saw the talk, it was about pro-social purpose, right? Which is a combination of two things that you're sort of dancing around. Number one is meaning, which is exactly what your question was about. And number two is impact. Right? And we need both. One is about making a contribution, and the other is about knowing your work serves a greater good, right? And so like you said in that example, you could leave tomorrow and JP Morgan would be fine. That's true. But not everyone at JP Morgan would be fine. And not everyone that you serve through your work at JP Morgan would be fine. And so that's what I kind of encourage people to do. I jokingly, when I work with teams, sometimes I jokingly run this thing I call the It's a Wonderful Life test. Do you remember the movie It's a Wonderful Life, right? Classic Christmas movie, even though it was a total flop at the box office and nobody actually wanted to watch it until it was in the public domain and TV networks didn't have to pay anyone to show it. So they did, and it became a Christmas classic. True story. Anyway, the whole premise of that movie is a man, George Bailey, feels like his life has no meaning, feels like it has no impact, etc. And he's going to jump off a bridge and commit suicide. And an angel named Clarence, which is a really weird name for an angel in pretty much any faith tradition, comes to him and shows him a world. If he didn't exist, what would that world look like? And he sees in that moment his impact because of the void that is left, right, by his disappearance. And so, you know, the movie sort of culminates in Clarence, I want to live again, right? And I think teams and individuals are kind of the same way. Run that thought experiment. Yes, JP Morgan would be fine. I hate to tell you that about you. But there are clients you serve, or there's other people inside of the organization. There are people who you disappearing tomorrow would cause a disruption. And that is a subtle little hint at the fact that your work actually does make an impact, right? And then once you have the answer to that question, now you know what to fill your wins folder with. Now you know what to fill those reminders with. I'm a big fan of, I coach so many leaders to do this, but if your leader's not doing it, do it for yourself, which is you have your answer to the question, who is served by the work that we're doing? Your work matters, right? I mean, that's the reality. Your work matters. If it didn't, it would have been outsourced somewhere else already, right? If it didn't, AI would have already figured out how to do it. Your work matters. The question is, what can you do to remind yourself who it matters for, and then build in those regular reminders, whether that's thank you notes that come from those clients, whether it's just remembering that time you got a quick high five from somebody else in the office, et cetera. Those are all indicators. And when we get so overwhelmed, again, doing that 75% that doesn't light us up, we forget about those reminders. So that would be my two things, right? We already kind of talked about the reminders, but maybe what you need first is that answer to that question, who is served by the work that I do? Specifically who, not the whole organization, but the specific people, names if you have to, roles if you can't find specific names, and kind of dwell and focus in on those, because those are the clues to where you really are making an impact.
I think that's so good, and it's really helpful to remember that, or the companies are an amalgamation of individual people, and you know we speak about it in sort of third person in this sort of objectification sense, but it is a team. You know, no one, when people say I work for JP Morgan or I work at JP Morgan, what they mean is I'm part of a team of 4 people who are handling this specific task, not some, you know, mass army that's called JP Morgan.
Right.
Okay,
And
well,
one
there's
thing,
this
if I may, one thing I try and remind a lot of leaders of is the opposite. So I'm really famous for saying this often. Like I was asked one time, well, what would you put on a billboard if you could write anything on a billboard? And I chose people don't work for you. Right? In other words, like what I would love, if I could shake Jamie Dimon for a second, what I would love to tell him is like, these people don't work for you. They don't work for JP Morgan Chase. They work on a team, and that team's other specific people, and that's who they work for. They just happen to work with you. You're the brand, you're the covering under which they're doing that work, but they're doing that work for other specific people. And think about how you talk to them and communicate them, what metrics you celebrate, all of those sort of things, because that who is at the core of keeping them engaged.
That is really good. And I think for anyone who leads a team, thinking like that is very helpful, because it then encourages you at least to try and create an environment where whatever teams you set up can sort of thrive, and not, they're not just coming to sort of give you stuff they've done. You're creating space for them. What I was going to ask you following that is this age-old question that people always ask, and it's even more important because in the UK we're currently in the middle of a cost of living crisis. I imagine it's the same in America. Inflation's super high and it's very hard to live, put it that way. And now, again, finishing university or even after working for a few years, people have that period where they go, do I need to optimize for money with my job, or do I need to optimize for, as we said, meaning and enjoyment? And with some of the stuff you're saying, is it best for me just to try and get the job that pays the most, and I'll find meaning there somehow, or should I try and sort of follow my heart, as it were, knowing I won't get paid that much?
Yeah, well, I think follow your heart is terrible advice, because your heart changes, and because like I told you earlier about my wife, she's an ER physician, and she's really, really lucky because she's one of those people who, if you asked her at 11 years old, 12 years old, what she wanted to do, she'd tell you she wants to be a doctor, and now she's a doctor. But now I have an 11-year-old, and so I can tell you most 11-year-olds have no idea how many options are available to them, right? Think about when you were a kid. What did you want to be? Doctor, firefighter, police officer, school teacher, etc. Because they were the only roles you said. Financial analyst is not a role you're aware of when you're 12 or 11 years old. It's just not. So that idea of follow your passion, like whose passion? This is why people go to Warwick or whatever undergraduate university. They go to 4-year university and then they never work in that major, because asking an 18-year-old to pick a path they'll be on for the rest of their life in an ever-changing world is a ridiculous proposition. Right? So follow your passion is sort of terrible advice, because you're going to change what you're passionate about. I would say two things, right? And this is where a lot of the conventional wisdom switches to follow your mastery, right? And follow the things that you can get really, really good at and develop in your skills at and what have you, and where your strengths are. But some people's strengths are also not what kind of lights them up, that 25% we were talking about. So I would say follow the things you are decent at but excited about doing, because if you're excited about doing, you will get better and better and better at it. And then you can add some purpose into it, right? If you let's just keep kicking investment bankers, if we will, if you're running that and you're spending your whole day in spreadsheets and doing calculations, and it actually excites you, right? And you can find a path to get 25% or more of your task doing the things that excite you, and you can find some meaning in it, you will eventually be world-class at it, top 25% at least, right? Because you're excited enough to stay with it forever, right? So do that, and don't worry about this sort of short-term now. Right? On the other hand, right, I wouldn't say optimize for the money will take care of itself. On the other hand, I wouldn't say optimize for money, right? Because you might end up you could do the same analysis. You're an investment banker, you're good at the spreadsheets, but it drains you. And now it's sort of not worth the fact that you've overcome that cost of living crisis, right? So I would say that. Now, the other thing I would tell you is there's this whole idea of, you see it in a lot of young people that are following their passion, and as a result, they're sort of like a barista at an esoteric coffee shop, and they're living with 17 other people to fight the cost of living crisis, and their fear is like selling out, right? Or if I go into corporate, if I do this or that. There are things about that job that you're doing now that doesn't pay well, that excite you, that are available in jobs that are pay higher. There are, right? You just have to have the courage to kind of find them. right? So yeah, that's a weird sort of amalgamation of advice, and I hope it was clear, right? Is it's not entirely follow the money, and it's not entirely follow the passion. It's follow those activities that light you up and excite you, and trust that the money will take care of itself because your skills will eventually develop, and truthfully, the sense of meaning you derive from it will eventually develop. But usually, passion or intrinsic motivation comes first, and mastery comes second, and money comes third.
No, absolutely. And I think I have my lived experience like bears witness to that. You know, if you told me like what I do now, I still don't know. I still dread meeting new people when they're like, what do you do? And I'm sort of, I just say, now I just say I work in tech.
I have, dude. I run into the exact same thing. It was actually not me. My wife. I remember she came home one day and she goes, "How do I tell people what you do?" And I was like, "You just don't. Just tell them I'm a stay-at-home dad. It's easier."
You know, and I have no qualm saying that. You know, even though I don't. Now we do a gathering at my house ever so often, and you know, new people come all the time, and they're like, "I'm a teacher, I'm a doctor, but what do you do?" And I just honestly, it changes each time. Because I did not know what I'm doing now was an option, as you said, when I was younger. And I definitely had a period of literally earning no money and being like, well, this makes no sense. You know, how is this going to work? But you are right. As you get good, and getting good is, for me, I think, a function of, yes, being switched on, but also just doing it for long enough that you sort of, if anything, you make a lot of mistakes and you've paid a lot of ignorance tax. And now you're sort of like, okay, I know now. And I suppose in the sort of microwave generation thing, people have a hard time staying at things. And so again, another trend we see here in the sort of young professional market is folks that change jobs every 6 months or so because one has 4K more or one has 3K more. And when you drill it down in terms of our taxation system, I know this is something you don't have to endure in your land of milk and honey, but over here, in terms of take-home pay, sometimes it's only like £300 more that people take home, but they hop jobs. I mean, from your experience and everything kind of you've seen, I mean, is that an optimal way to sort of search for meaning, sort of moving jobs every few months, every few years?
I mean, I think there's one benefit to the fact that this is sort of a cultural trend, which is that it used to be if you graduated university and you graduated into a job you hated, we used to tell people to stick around for a year or two before you quit because you don't want to be seen as a transient, etc. Well, now that's shorter because there are a lot of transients, right? So there's one sort of positive, but the rest of it, I'd say no, right? And the reason I'd say no is that if you're paying attention to the money, first of all, like you said, it's a couple $100 pay period. It's not worth it. But the other thing is that when you're switching jobs, you're rolling the dice again on the people that you're with. I think this is the most ridiculous thing about younger adults and maybe all adults, but especially when you're starting out your career, you become so obsessed with the brand that you're going to work for. Right? That it's a big notable company. Maybe it's got a huge market capitalization. Maybe it doesn't, but it's getting all sorts of headlines, et cetera. And not the people you'll actually be working for on a day-to-day basis and the people you'll be working with, right? So if you're in a toxic environment after 6 months or what have you, and the people you're working with are dragging you down, yeah, please, by all means, get the heck out of there, right? But if you're in a great environment and you're just going to jump to another job for another $3,000, $4,000 on your annual salary, that's a terrible idea because you're going to roll the dice on who you're working with and alongside, and maybe they're going to add so much more stress to your life than you had over here. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Now, I will make one exception to that rule, which is the data on careers is really, really clear, and that is that people who climb up the corporate ladder of one organization do not progress in their careers as fast as people who switch companies in order to move up into a new role. So I'll give you permission for that, right? Don't go somewhere and do a lateral move that pays a little bit more. But if you're just relying on, we keep picking on JP Morgan, but whatever, they probably deserve it. I'm kidding. That's so bad. I actually know a lot of people. I know a ton of people inside of JP Morgan who are actually amazing people. I do a lot of work in the financial industry and they're all great people, but you started it. But if you're working there, and you're saying, I'm going to stay here forever, I'm not climb up the corporate ladder, your career is going to take longer because you have to wait on other people to move up or move out or die or what have you before you can go for that role. Versus if it pops up at, let's say, RBC, right, or some other financial institution, that role that you're ready for but not promoted into yet, go for it. Please, because you will progress faster in that regard, right? So that's the one exception I give you permission. Now, that's not every 6 months. That's probably going to be every 3 to 5 years. But that's still going to make you towards the money and towards the progression and towards doing the work of mastery in your own career and deriving fulfillment a little bit faster than if you were to stay with the same organization.
That's really good. And again, this is just forming perfectly because I promise people listening and watching, I did not give David these questions before because every answer is leading them to my next question.
I thought we were going to talk about Meghan Markle the whole time because I'm an American. I thought that's what we were going to do.
We're going to get there. But
no, please, we don't have to. We really don't. We really don't.
I'm playing. Although she's literally in the news today, I don't want to age when we're recording this for different reasons. But
you don't have to. You saying she's in the news, by the way, could be any time in the last 2 years or next 4.
This is also very true. No, I was going to ask you about sort of moving up the corporate ladder or just any job. Like, what advice would you give younger people? And I suppose this really isn't for young people. It's for everybody who decides that, hey, I really want to sort of move upwards. I need to kind of get myself ready for promotion. A lot of young people who speak to me, particularly young people, don't really know how to say, hey, I want to move up. I want to get paid more. Especially in the UK, we have a very interesting culture here where you folks in America typically say what you think. Folks here almost never say what they think. And so young people sometimes stay in jobs, stay in roles that they know they've outgrown, desiring more responsibility, but never knowing quite how to make it known that they're trying to sort of move up. So how should they navigate?
Yeah. So, we see that in America too. Actually, in America, and I've never looked at the research in Europe, but I'm going to dive into this when we get off, or actually, because it's a Friday, I'm not, but I will eventually dive into this. In America, one of the things you tend to see is actually there's a split between men and women in that capacity, where women will tend to go for promotions or put their name in the hat for promotions when they feel like they are 100% or close to 100% qualified for it. And men, probably because they score higher on things like the narcissistic personality inventory, will go for it at about 60 to 75%, right? And I bring that up not only because that's a sort of a massive problem when we think about gender gaps and what have you, but I think it's also a message for anybody who might be in that mentality that I've got to be 100% for it. No, you don't. You have to get comfortable with rejection. But if you are ready to move into that new role and you apply at 3 different firms for 3 different versions of that new role and you're 60 to 75% complete, you might get it. Right? And then you're in that role faster than if you waited to 100% and if you waited in that same organization. And the other thing is, if you don't get it, you'll at least get feedback on what you need to develop. Right? And that's the uncomfortable thing I think happens, especially, and again, we're picking on young people almost as much as we're picking on JP Morgan Chase. But especially when you're in that first 10 years of your career, you can often think you're qualified before you actually are. And that feedback about why we're not considering you for the role, et cetera, is incredibly useful because it tells you what you need to be working on to get ready for that role. And then, by the way, let's say it's entirely internal promotion. If you say, hey, I want to go for this, and they say, well, you're not ready, and you push back on that and go, okay, why? Tell me what things I need to be working on in the next year. And then you go work on them and you can document that you worked on them and develop them. And by the way, if you have a decent manager, they will also be helping you with this. In fact, you have a decent manager because they are. If they're not, then you don't have a decent manager. They will be helping you in this. And then a year later, you've got a documented record of, you said I needed to develop in these areas and develop these skills, and we've been working on that. Am I ready now? Right? So that would be my biggest overarching piece of that advice is don't wait till you're 100% to go for it. 60, 75% good enough, because you don't know who else is in the application pool. You don't know how much the person who's hiring is going to be favoring attitude and internal motivation over pure skills. You can train skills, right? And worst case scenario, you get rejected and you get a list of things you can work on, and then you.
Yeah. And that's it. It's not as risky as people think. I think perhaps what it is folks don't want to out themselves as, I'm trying to. Yeah, I guess I know to a certain degree, climbing up a corporate ladder seems greasy, or it seems sort of like self-promoting, and maybe some people just don't want to out themselves as that, or don't want to be seen as that. It's the same thing here in the UK. To kind of shift gears into politics, it's well known for young people who maybe are politically savvy. If you ask them, "Do you want to be a politician?" You never say yes. You've got to say, you just must hide your interest in and because in this country, to say you want to be a politician means you're either crazy or you are so narcissistic that something's wrong with you, so to speak. And that's the kind of how people see it. And it's a shame because I wish, I literally met a younger kind of brother of mine not too long ago who had always told me he wanted to be a politician. And now that he's coming of age and I'm like, so are you getting active in the party, so on and so forth? He's like, yeah, but I don't want anyone to know. And I was like, mate, you can't sneak into parliament. You literally have to win a popularity contest. People will know that you want to be, and you've got to feel comfortable enough saying, I want to, lead this constituency, or I want to. And I find a lot of people are scared to make it known their desires or their ambition. Why has ambition become a dirty word, do you think?
I don't know that it is. So interestingly enough, two things happened to me on the exact same flight about 2 days ago, which is that I found myself sitting next to someone who is being recruited into politics. I don't know if this happens in the UK, maybe because we don't have as many people in the US who actually want to get into politics. But, and he was middle-aged, 50-something years old, but he's a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, former naval officer, then successful business person and what have you. You can already guess which party he's being recruited into just based on that. But they were basically trying to convince him, hey, you could do this, right? That's what we have to do over here a lot of times, except for our extreme narcissists who actually want to do it. But we have to convince people into doing it. The other thing that happened is that I was watching John Wick 4, which I finally got around to watching. And there's a pivotal line that I wanted to tattoo on my arm. I'm not going to, because I don't like tattoos. I would just try and erase them. But there was a line in there where one character says to another, a man's ambition should never exceed his ability. And I think that's the good line. When you're truly being sleazy, it's when your ambitions are actually exceed your actual skill set, and as a result, you think your skill set is greater than it is. Do you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean here, right? So there's a lot of people who want to go for positions that they are eminently unqualified for, and those are the ones that make us feel weird and sleazy or what have you. I could get into specifics in UK politics, but it's a minefield and I'm not going to. I could do it in the US too, but those are the people that make us feel sleazy. You want all of this, but you are very clearly down here. If you are ambitious, but you truly have developed the skills to actually achieve something, that's okay, right? Now the better thing to
I'm struggling a bit. So I take the point, and as a sort of card carrying member of the sort of I really believe in competence, and I think we have a massive crisis of competence. There's a headline for you: a crisis of competence in leadership around the world. But I do wonder, though. I mean, let's pick America. Obviously, we share an interest in America. I do wonder what politician I would say's ambition matches because to think that you could be the president is a pretty wild thing to believe of yourself, that I have the skills to lead 340 million people. I mean, who really is quote unquote qualified? Because even someone like, let's go back in history, Trump, obviously I would say wasn't qualified because he had never done any, he had never worked any, say, junior, public service roles, unless you think being a businessman is qualification enough for that. Obama, folks said he was too young. Biden is too old. Hillary Clinton has the wrong chromosomes. I mean, we could.
Well, I don't think Hillary's problem was that she had the wrong chromosomes. I think that was one of a myriad of problems. But yeah. No, Hillary's actually a great example, right? So first of all, there's a difference between qualifications and abilities. Right? There's a difference between qualifications and abilities. There are a lot of. Obama is actually a better example. I was going to use Hillary, but Obama's an even better example. Obama was massively underqualified for the role, but he had the abilities, had the intelligence, had the social intelligence, what have you, to be pretty decent in the role. And I say that as somebody who did not vote for him, right? I live in Oklahoma where the libertarian candidate is always on there, and I tend to just like check that box as a protest vote.
You might as well check it the bid after.
Matter, right? Right. I know where my electoral votes are going even before I vote. So that shapes a whole thing. Now, for those of you who are actively engaged in politics, and listen, I just want to preface, I don't do that on the local levels and the places where it matters. But Obama's a great example of someone who you'd say too young, hasn't had enough things, not qualified. But the abilities were actually there. Right. And so, and that's what I mean. I don't necessarily wait for all those qualifications, because the only people who are qualified to be president are people who've been president for probably 4 years. Right. And the only people who are qualified to be CEOs are people who have been CEOs. You're never 100% qualified for the role. That's what I was getting at earlier when I was saying, don't wait till you're 100% qualified. 60, 75% is fine. There's a difference between that and abilities. Right. But there are certain people that I can say this, and I'm looking at thinking about the GOP primary, which is going on as we're recording this. There's a number of people in that race who have abilities.
Are you guys actually having a primary?
Yeah, no, we're definitely having one. Trust me, we're having one. I know there are a lot of people who don't want us to have one, but you can ask your friend Hillary, coronations don't tend to work out all that well, do they? So we're having a primary.
Oh, God.
But what I mean by that is there's a number of people who you look at and you go, yeah, you know what? You've demonstrated a past track record of having the abilities to solve those unfamiliar problems when you get up there. And then you can look at people and go, dude, you don't have it, right? You just don't have it. And so that's what I'm talking about. I think the people that come off as sleazy for having ambition are the people who you just want to pull aside and go, hey, buddy, you're not going to make it, right? And here's why. Not the people that you say you're unqualified for. Everyone's unqualified for every role they go after, right? Because you unless you've been in the role before and you're looking to make a lateral move. And even then, the world changes so fast that in the next 5 years, you'll probably face challenges that weren't part of your job 5 years ago. So you're always going to be unqualified. The question is whether or not you've got the qualifications that matter are a track record of rising to the occasions you've met, and that gets people to put trust in you. So I'm pivoting back here away from politics because that's going to get us both canceled, and back to career. The difference is you've got a track record of rising to the challenges you were faced with, and that leaves people feeling like, yeah, there's more in you. You actually have more abilities. I'm going to give you that shot. And those people, when they come off as ambitious, it's different than the people who you look at and they're highly ambitious and you're just like, buddy, you're never going to make it.
Hey there, just want to say thank you for listening or for watching this podcast. We have a great desire to grow this podcast, and one of the ways we're going to do that is if you listening follow, or if you are watching, you subscribe to the podcast. The faster it grows, the more guests we can get, but also the better the podcast gets. So please, just do me a favor, hit the subscribe button or the follow button. Back to the episode. So I agree.
With all of it?
There's been much of this conversation. Just me nodding. Well, I just a few days ago was speaking at the Head Teachers Conference, which is a conference of head teachers. That's self-explanatory, actually. I didn't know if I needed to say all of that. And we were talking about sort of a crisis of leadership, right? In the UK, we have lots of issues here with leaders, whether it be Boris Johnson, Kwasi Kwarteng, Liz Truss. We've had a kind of litany of leaders that haven't maybe set the best examples. And so the tone for leadership in the country, these head teachers were telling me, is really off. And so when they're trying to lead, kids in school, kids do see, prime ministers and leaders of countries as sort of beacons to look up to. And I guess if you've been looking at leaders in this country over the past few months and years, a lot of them have been found wanting. As someone who talks a lot about leadership and writes about leadership, would love you to end this conversation, and this is definitely your part one. I think we can talk about more things, but
do a whole thing on the crisis of leadership.
Yeah. But I thought maybe to preempt that conversation, I just wondered what your closing note would be on how young people, or even again working professionals, as we've been speaking about, can take more leadership in a cultural climate that maybe isn't really conducive or helpful.
Yeah, I think you step into leadership specifically not of your own ambition, but out of your ambition to use your abilities to serve others. That's why I said people don't work for you, right? So number one, gut check yourself and make sure that's the case, that you don't just want to get your own apartment instead of sharing, and that's why you're going for that manager position, right? That you actually believe you've got abilities that can make a difference. And then the second is, I think, tell yourself those stories that are of leaders who demonstrated that in past history. One of the weirdest things about where we are right now culturally, both in the UK and the US, is we seem to be hating our own history, which is a shame because it's filled of stories of people who rose to the occasion and leadership was an act of service for them. You know, we have, and the modern headlines are not that. We have too many stories of CEOs embezzling funds or running companies into the ground or what have you, and we have too few stories like my CEO hero is a man named Alan Mulally. Alan Mulally turned around Ford from 2006 to 2008, but he already had a completely successful career at Boeing. The first time they came to him to be CEO of Ford, he said no. He's like, I don't want to do it, right? And then the second time they came to him further and he was like, no, they need a turnaround, and I do really think I've got the skills and the plan to do it, and so I have to do it, right? Look for those stories to remind yourself that there are them. You may have to look pretty far back, but there are definitely those stories, even if they're not making headlines now, they're in history books in the past, and soak yourself in that so you remind yourself that leadership is an act of service.
David, this was brilliant. I really, really, really enjoyed talking to you. I mean, we talk a lot, you know, off air anyways. This is just nice to kind of record one, and one that we both won't be cancelled for, as you said. But maybe next time we get closer to the fault lines and talk about Trump's many charges and all these all these other things.
Yeah, maybe.
But
maybe we'll keep that on WhatsApp too. Who knows?
Well, thank you for taking part in this, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.